What I want to talk about today is this idea of building a software community-driven tester skills program. What that actually means is I'm working with a group of people who are professional software testing, QA and assurance professionals in Ireland, and with about 20 companies or so, and we're trying to define the skills that their people need to make progress as graduate hires or as seasoned professionals, because the world is changing. And so what I want to talk about really is how we need to make a shift in how we think about testing and how we skill up our people, but also how we can make that happen. And what I'm doing in Cork is my proposal for how we might do this, but it's an open project in that I'm interested in hearing what people think about what we're doing and whether we can make a better job of it. At any rate, I want to talk about two areas really, which is why we need to change, and then really how I'm proposing we do this, and in particular what I'm doing in Ireland. Certainly I don't think the ways we've worked in the past will work in the future in the same way. Obviously the principles don't change over time, but the logistics, which is a word I'll use a lot today, the logistics are specific to every project, every organisation. Almost every individual has their own style of logistics. So I'm trying to suggest that we step back from logistics and think about how we test in a more systematic way. And I want to suggest that there's a different skill set actually required for the testers of the future. Then I'll talk about what I'm doing in Ireland and give a bit of background. And essentially the mission statement is really to teach testers to think for themselves. So rather than be dependent on being spoon-fed from the certification schemes, which is very prevalent and very widespread and very popular in some places and unpopular in others, my suggestion is we teach people to think for themselves, to make their own choices about how they operate in their testing environments. Now, in the spirit of openness, I should suggest that I was the first chair of the British Computer Society ISCB Tester Certification Board in 1997. Essentially, there was the first tester certification in the world, and my good friend Dorothy Graham and myself got this off the ground. I chaired it for the startup phase and then kind of stepped aside. And as ISTQB emerged as an international scheme, I think it all has its kind of heritage, its original thought processes are all based on what we did 22 years ago now. So let me talk about what I think is the problem we've got to solve here. The pressures on testers are kind of greater than ever, and you've probably heard that every year in every presentation for the past 20 years if you've been around that long. But I think it's slightly different this time in that we've got this thing called digital front and centre of what we all have to work on. Certainly in the Western societies, digital is taking off, certainly for business as well as government, all pushing forwards with the digitisation of their businesses and their data in particular. So digital requires new approaches because part of this is the notion of rapid iteration, experimentation in production, testing in production, and so on. So the pressure on testers is huge because these are approaches that don't put an emphasis on testing and what testers actually do. They kind of take testing a little bit for granted. And so the whole idea of shift left, DevOps, continuous delivery, pervasive automation, experimentation, and so on and so on and so on, are all pushing testers in slightly different directions, but certainly putting pressure on them. Now, one of the challenges we have as an industry is these approaches are not standardized. There are tools appearing almost every day, every week at least. And so there's no testing formula anymore. It's not like all projects are waterfall and this is how you do it. We need a new way of thinking about testing, and we need some new ideas. And this is where I'm trying to encourage people to think a bit more carefully about what they do and how they approach testing to deliver their testing mission. And you could say that the underlying message of all this is that testers now need to think for themselves, because they have to think on their feet. They can't just bring a prepared set of processes and just apply them anymore. It just doesn't work anymore in modern environments. So I want to explore a couple of areas that are examples of where the way we think about testing is going to have to change. And the first one is continuous delivery, and I'm sure you've seen this kind of picture before. If not, where have you been? But the principle of continuous delivery is to break up projects which might take months or years to deliver into much, much smaller pieces and segments. So in principle, we are working towards monthly, weekly, daily, maybe even hourly delivery schedules. Now, this idea of creating a piece of functionality that can be specified, designed, coded, tested, deployed, and implemented into production in hours is a relatively new phenomena. By that I mean the last 10 years or so. But some of the bigger online software businesses, the Googles, the Amazons, the eBays of the world, have been doing this for many years. And so this specialist approach, if you like, for the larger software businesses is now being applied in a more generic way with companies that you wouldn't expect to take on such a rapid iterative delivery process. But the angle is this, is that we try and specify our functionality to a degree that we can scope it in a very accurate and precise way at a small level, in a small quanta, if you like, and then implement it in a very rapid process, which is very much supported by automation almost everywhere, pervasive automation, and the testing, although most of it is automated, the tester has to fit into this process. Now, when people describe continuous delivery, they usually reference some model or other to reflect the ongoing, continuous, infinite loop kind of process. And so this kind of infinite loop, this figure of 8 picture, is bandied around the internet and certainly by consultants who are offering services in this area. And I want to explore this in a little bit more detail and just pick it apart a little bit, because I think it's misleading. If we have this figure of 8 in mind and we unroll it into a straight line, what you see is this idea of plan, code, build, test, release. Hold on, this is waterfall, isn't it? This is a staged process. The fact that you have this feedback loop or this restart, go to the beginning again, whether it's a figure of 8 shape or not, it's still a staged process in how it's presented. So this kind of is a real distraction to me, because it makes me think that people haven't really bought into continuity, to continuous delivery. They're just regarding continuous delivery as a scaled down version of waterfall. And I just don't think that works. Now, another aspect of this is how automation fits into what we do as testers. And I'm sure you've seen Lisa Crispin and other people that have contributed to this kind of picture, this test automation pyramid. But I have a problem with this in that it does make a sensible suggestion that the bulk of testing would be at a unit level and they're probably automated. And at the top of the pyramid, we have our manual tests, which are manual, but not automated. And GUI tests, we know, are hard to automate, so we tend to have fewer of them, even though they can be quite long-winded and convoluted. But I want to compare that with something, a piece of history, if you like, and that's the V model. The V model that we all dismissed 20 years ago as being focused on waterfall. What we see in the test automation pyramid is a reflection of that V model thinking again. It's a staged process again. We're still using the language of waterfall, the V model, in our processes and in our automation. So I want to challenge this. This is the problem I've got, in that I think waterfall thinking is still dominating a lot of people's presentation of how continuous delivery works. Now, I made a list of the kind of things that I think cause us problems if we are trying to use staged thinking in a continuous environment. And you can see that the kind of aspects that I'm talking about one stage follows another. It's sequential. You can't vary the stages. You can't jump a stage or go back and loop. And there's no avoiding the notion of dependencies between one stage and the next. And I could go through all these about it's not re-entrant. We know testing has stages. Testing is continuous throughout a stage process. We can't live with this. And at the end of the day, if you think back to, I have to say, 20 years ago, the arguments for going down the agile route as an alternative to structured waterfall methods were these very same aspects. This idea of sequential thinking not working anymore in a collaborative, iterative, dynamic, fast-moving, agile team. So the argument against the way that we're talking about continuous is the same argument that was used to promote agile. So stage thinking won't work in a continuous process, because if it's defined as a staged process, that is. So my argument with all this is that we need to think a bit more clearly about how we operate as testers in these kind of environments. And I'm going to suggest that we remove this idea of logistics. I'm going to suggest that we remove all the stuff that complicates and clutters up our thinking, because what I want to get to is how we think about testing as a mechanism for making better choices of how we deliver our testing mission. So I'm going to suggest this, that for the time being, I'm going to suggest that I do not care whether we document our tests or not. I do not care whether we automate our tests or we execute them manually, or we use some other piece of magic. I don't care whether we're agile or waterfall. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the way we think about our testing mission. It doesn't matter what business you're in, and it doesn't matter what technology you're using. The thinking process for testing is kind of the same. I want to make that argument. So what we're left with is a way of looking at testing through the lens of being a more dynamic, iterative, and improvisational activity rather than a stage process. So we're moving from a sequential stage process to, and here's a little piece of the magic, I guess, a continuous event-driven thought process. So some of you who've been around a long time will remember the transition from green screens, whether it was mainframes or mini computer terminals. When we moved from green screens to testing GUIs, we had to understand what event-driven processes were about, because GUIs are event-driven. Anything can happen at any time, at any moment in your process. And in the same way, we have to move from a sequential, staged way of thinking to an event-driven thought process to be able to react to challenges that occur at any time of day, whether it's a change to the requirement at the last minute, whether it's a bug found in testing, whether it's a rethink of a design and we have to adjust very quickly. These are all things that can happen, and we have to react in the middle of our process. We don't have to go to the beginning of the process all over again. So what I'm showing you now is this picture of a model of the thinking activities, the thought processes that testers go through, and it's completely devoid of logistics. How we implement testing, how we document our requirements, how we capture our tests, how we execute our tests. These are all things that are removed from the model, because we're just looking at how people think when they go through the test process. So I'm going to use this model as the basis of this idea, this concept of a dynamic, event-driven thought process. Now, these activities, these 10 thinking activities, are all associated with actual physical, logistical activities, as I've said. But the thought processes are things that our brains are such good machines in that we can run some of these processes in parallel. Sometimes on the very same feature or on a handful of features, we're thinking about 3 or 4 or 5 of these different thought processes at the same time. So we shouldn't think of these thought processes as stages, but they're just modes of thinking. Our brains flip from one requirement at this level of completion to another requirement at another level of completion. We are flipping around, context switching all the time. And so we have to be very, very agile in our thinking in order to be able to do this. So For each feature in our portfolio that we're working on, we might have a different status, and I'm going to suggest that the way we think about a feature or a requirement is the status itself. So status equals what do we think we are doing right now with this requirement. It's not about putting requirements on Kanban boards. So our thinking is dynamic and event-driven, and our processes should also be flexible enough to deal with this dynamic, event-driven and not staged approach. So I've hinted that actually what status is actually what we are thinking about at the time. So when we go around the table, the three amigos say, and we say, well, what do we think of this feature? The developer might say, well, I'm writing the code, I'm done, it's ready to go. The user might say, well, I'm done too, my requirement is complete, I can see the developer's making good progress. And the tester might say, well, wait a minute, I've got some challenges with that requirement because as far as I can tell it's untestable or it's unbuildable because there's an anomaly in the thinking behind the requirement. There might be a conflict between two scenarios for one feature. There might be a gap, a feature that's missing. There might be a ambiguity in the outcome of a particular scenario or the whole feature itself. What I want to suggest is status is what we are thinking and doing, not where we put it on a board, simply as a parking place for the feature to give us a sense of making progress. Now, the whole purpose of doing continuous delivery is there is continuous collaboration, a very reactive, very agile, hyper-agile almost, response to events which challenge us. So it almost doesn't matter who in the three amigos say, the analysts, users, stakeholders, developers, testers, it doesn't matter who does what and which bit of the thinking is. My suggestion is this, that collaboration is the responses to these events and interactions, and we use these responses to drive requirements along the pipeline. Now we know the tester's probably going to still act as the conscience of the project and challenge requirements and challenge the thinking of people in the team, and that's a good thing. But if there's no tester in the team, these thought processes can still happen. So it could be the developer who does the challenging of requirements. It could be the user who does the testing of the feature. There's no rule which says you cannot do this way. And it could be that some, most, perhaps even all the testing could be automated. So here's my thesis, that we need a very different skill set to make progress in these kind of environments. Now, a few years ago, when I started talking about this idea of a new model, I thought, surely this shifts the way that we think about skills in our testing professionals. And I came up with this quite speculative diagram of how we might split up the skills and capabilities, which might be a better word, capabilities, how we split them up into, say, a foundation level as a technical specialism perhaps, then there are managers, and then there's a strategy aspect, the consulting kind of game at the top. So you can see there's kind of 16. I mean, this is not backed up by 20 years of data or anything like that. It's completely speculative. But it makes sense to me to think in terms of these kind of skills areas. Now, what I realized very quickly is that the certification schemes, ISTQB and TMMI as a mechanism for making improvements in the test process, are very much focused on methodology and process management and implementation. This is kind of their core focus, if you like. They don't look at the more technicalities of testing, for example. Now, if you do look at that and you look at the table of contents, for example, of the ISTQB Foundation scheme, you see that most of the table of contents in that 80-page document or so is logistics. Now, what's very apparent when you think this way is that what ISTQB are promoting are methods of implementing testing. Then these methods I call logistics. They're very much focused on logistics. These are the things I said I do not care about when it comes to thinking about the test process. So the certification schemes have this logistical focus, and because of that they tend to offer just one way of implementing testing. They say, here is the standard approach to logging incidents or observations or anomalies. There's a standard way of doing equivalence partition test design. There's a standard way of reporting progress and defects through a plan. There's a standard way of staging your test process in order to implement testing in a systematic way. So it's very kind of fixed in the way it works. And much of the content is about remembering definitions, and certainly when it comes to the examination, a lot of the questions tend to be about the best or closest definition to a term. So a lot of the revision for the exam is about memorizing almost the syllabus, because the questions are very much based on the syllabus. Now, I think the most serious problem I have personally is that they teach test design as procedures. There's a set way of implementing the design of a test using one of the test design techniques. But what they're not doing is they're not teaching modelling. They're teaching how to use a model that's on the table to make choices of test cases. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, except that when people then encounter real requirements and they have to do the modelling aspect of test design, they have a problem because they've not been taught how to think about modelling, how to regard a requirement as a model itself. So the schemes don't teach thinking skills. Now, overall, when you do the exam, I don't think the multiple choice exams are a very good reflection on the ability of the people who take them in terms of how good a tester are they. Having a certificate does not mean anything with respect to your ability as a professional tester. And this is the biggest problem of all. Now, this is very well known. This has been talked about for as long as the certification schemes have been around. I remember having these conversations in the room when we were creating these multiple choice questions at the time. So this is well understood and well known. And of course, for this reason, some people think the scheme is really unworkable and not very useful. So it's a kind of a Marmite subject where people either love certification because it fits their culture and their goals, or they hate it. There's no in between. So I want to talk about what I'm doing in Cork with a group of companies who invited me over to help them define a skills program for their people. And the drivers for this were some pretty obvious kind of challenges, like they're recruiting computer science graduates who know little or nothing about testing. So what use is their computer science degree almost to them as a tester? Also, the skills that are available through the certification schemes don't match the challenges that these companies face. Now, I was invited by Skillnet, IT at Cork, Skillnet, who are a government-sponsored body that pay attention to the skills of the local tech communities, and testing is one of those skills, needless to say. And so they were happy to invest some time and effort and a little money to get this kind of thing off the ground. Softtest Ireland are the Irish software testing specialist interest group, so the equivalent of the SIGIST in the UK, and there are similar organisations in most countries that have a software industry now. So the slide that you have in front of you isn't mine, it's from the chair of the group, who introduced the whole activity in the first session, which him having introduced it, I facilitated to gather some requirements and gather some information about the challenges that these companies actually face and need to address. But you can see the title is pretty clear cut: Developing Testing Skills to Address Product Quality Challenges. Now this kind of mission, if you like, is what's driving this whole process, because the product quality challenges are wide and various. Now, the other thing to say is, in the room when we kicked it off, is pretty much everybody was on the demand side for training. That is, they were software products and software development businesses, or represented organisations that make a lot of use of software, that build their own software, and so on. There were no training providers in the room. So the hope and expectation was that whatever came out of these discussions would be what the market wants, not what training providers want to sell. And that's really important, needless to say. And I have to say, from my perspective, is I am in this respect acting as a training provider. There's no question of this. But I didn't contribute very much to the conversations about what would go into the scheme. I was the facilitator rather than a contributor in this respect. Now James, the person who chaired it, put this slide up, and it sets a very cold view on the state of testing and skills for testers. And he called it an existential crisis, in that there are, and very quickly without dwelling on this too long, there's a perception that testing is obsolete, that actually, you know what, we don't need testers, everything can be done with tools, the developers can operate these tools, and everything can flow through a continuous delivery pipeline without any input from testers at all, so that testers can be replaced by automation. Now this is it's partly a common perception, not absolutely 100% of course, but it's definitely a common hope that software development managers would love to get rid of their test teams and replace them with tools. It's an aspiration, and the problem is this aspiration is probably blinding some people to thinking it's actually possible. On the other hand, we have testers who cannot describe what value they add to their teams. So how do testers add value to their teams? A lot of testers cannot answer that question. They don't have the background, the skills to actually articulate what they do that really, really does have value to the team. There's also an evolution of roles, of course. The whole shift left thing has moved physical people from late in the project to early in the project to becoming embedded with development teams, but also there's an argument to have specialist software development engineers in teams. Now there are very few people of these around with the required skills, but there's an argument that we're all engineers, everyone must write code, testers need to be using tools rather than doing things manually wherever possible. Again, this is an aspiration that has kind of taken hold a little bit as if it was completely realistic, and it's just not. Not everybody wants to write code or will ever be good at it. With regards to the skills of testers, I mean, a long time ago you could say that testers weren't respected. Then it took almost a generation of testers, 25 years maybe, to now become a respected member of the team. But the tester mindset is beginning to slip in terms of its respectability, if you like, in that it's no longer valued. And the whole thing is being driven by a technology change that's just relentless, there's no question. And it affects everybody, developers of course, and users too. But testers have their own special problems with the fact that the technology changes at an unprecedented rate. The quality tends not to go up as technologies evolve. There tends to be a dip while people get the hang of the technology, how to build stuff and how to test it, of course. So that's the background. And so the summary, without going into the detail of how the whole scheme was introduced, is we can't eat the whole elephant. Okay, so the idea of this gathering was to identify the skills gaps of the people in the room and to identify the training needs that will apply and address these skills gaps, and hopefully develop what was called in the meeting a future skills program. So I could have called this session Future Skills for Software Systems Testers, and that would be just as good a name for it. But essentially what we're trying to achieve is a definition of the skills that testers will need from now and into the future. Now the vision was really to come up with a list of the skills, an inventory as I would call it. And these skills, some have dependencies on others, so there's a kind of a roadmap that would fall out fairly naturally in terms of how you would try and acquire the skills, how you would deliver the learning and development support to implement these skills. And there was already, right at the beginning, a notion that there would be a beginner or a foundation scheme for fresh graduates, say. There would be an advanced scheme for professional testers who've got experience but who want to look more deeply into some of the more critical aspects of it. And then there's the whole idea of a master level, which would suit consultants, coaches, mentors, and internal consultants in companies who are responsible for managing the testing and improving it over time. The expectation was that there would be a hybrid online and classroom course. There's a lot of material to get through. That was almost inevitably going to be the case. And people being in demand for their projects, online classes taken at their own pace is a partial solution to getting things done. And the other angle would be that if we had this, let's call it a specification for the training regime, what Skillnet need is to be able to present that specification to the training market and ask people, invite them to tender for the delivery of skills, learning and development processes and support in those areas. So the goal was not for example, me to be the sole supplier. The whole idea was to create a scheme that could be implemented in any geography in particular. Now, I won't dwell on this except to say that the core of the foundation scheme is built. We're going to pilot the course next month in Cork, get some feedback and hopefully refine it and finish the development of the foundation scheme. But the foundation scheme is in two chunks, let's call it. Here's a kind of overall view of, or a roadmap if you like, of the foundation scheme. The top level, the core modules 1, 2, 3 and 4, essentials, design, applying and people, is in effect a 3-day classroom course. The supplemental modules could be online or could be delivered in the classroom, but that would be 3 to 4 further days of training. So the whole thing is approximately 7 days classroom or online training. Now you'll note there's a few things that you might not see in other kind of schemes, in particular the certification schemes. Exploratory testing gets a much bigger emphasis because all testing is exploratory to some degree. There's a people section which talks about collaboration, communication and testing in teams, and that's in the foundation. It's in the core module. So it's as upfront as we could possibly make it. The whole notion of challenging requirements in designing tests, the second module, again, that's something that you would not normally expect to see. It's a very specific skill, capability that is required of our testers who are being helicoptered into projects that may already be running. The supplemental modules, the thinking skills section is probably the biggest, the obvious difference. Systems thinking, modelling and critical thinking. This is the most foundational skill for all software testing. It's in there front and centre as the start of the supplemental modules, what you might call the more advanced modules. All testing is based on models, so you see that section. There's a section on method, needless to say, where testers need to understand the process because they need to adapt their own personal or team processes to fit in with whether the company is waterfall or agile or continuous delivery. And the whole idea of adapting testing is part of the game. That has to be part of the skill set. There's a little bit on technical stuff and there's a little bit of managing. So even if this is focused on relatively junior testers, they still need to understand the notion of how this process gets managed. So overall, it's about 40 hours classroom and online classes. The offline assignments is as much again and more. So the whole idea of the training is that when the training is complete, or when a module is complete, or when a single lesson is complete, what the training gives the students, the testers, is a specific piece of practice that they could do in the activities, or a set of questions they can ask their peers or their manager or their stakeholders. So what we're trying to do is encouraging the employer organisation to take a big role in bringing their testers on. Now, this is what they would do naturally. When a company takes on a team of fresh graduates, it's obvious that there's a whole investment of time and effort and resources got to go into bringing those fresh graduates up to speed to make them productive. So there's nothing new here. What we're trying to do is give people a more specific program of work for the student tester to learn in the context of their own company logistics, in their own organisation, in their own context, environment, call it what you will. So the idea is that this is much more than training. It's a learning and development scheme, not just some classroom courses. Now the TSP, the Tester Skills Program, as we're calling it at the moment, it doesn't compete with certification. It's very much, if you look at the contents, it's very much non-logistical. So a lot of what's in the certification scheme is simply not on the agenda of the TSP. I mean, there's a big overlap, you could say, with the test design techniques perhaps, but whereas we're teaching modelling and how to select a technique and how to build your own techniques, and that's the whole idea of modelling, certification basically looks at the procedure of using a technique, and that's not the same thing. It's not just classroom course, it's a whole learning and development regime. The idea is that TSP teaches testing to a deeper level, so ultimately you can master the craft, but also be on the journey to become a coach, a mentor, or a consultant. The whole idea is that you have a deeper understanding of testing than you'll get from the certification schemes. Now, at the end of the day, we have a focus on non-logistics, so that's where the lack of overlap comes from. It's not a competitive scheme to the certification schemes. It's focused on teams that use pervasive automation, that are dynamic, continuous delivery, this kind of thing. So where continuous event-driven processes are emerging and testers have to think on their feet, these are the skills, the capabilities that we're trying to invest into people. Test also has a broader role than you would see in certification schemes, a broader role of assurance, going from requirements right through to customer experience optimization, the monitoring, logging and analytics that we get from live production. Now, testers are usually part of a mixed multidisciplinary team, and so we're trying to teach collaborative skills as well as just being part of a team, being spoon-fed requirements and asked to create test cases from paper. So we're trying to encourage different behaviours. We're trying to encourage more outward-facing, collaborative, proactive behaviours in our testers. So these new behaviours, in a bit more detail, we're asking people to think a bit more analytically. That's the whole idea of modelling, systems and critical thinking. We're trying to suggest that testers move from being a passive, almost a victim in their projects, to become proactive, to challenge and refine requirements and to be an advisor to everyone who tests in their projects. Testers need to understand what happens in production, the monitoring, logging, analytics, and this whole customer experience optimization. So testers are beginning to be drawn into using machine learning and AI to support testing. It's the early days, but we still need to have an understanding of these things because the data is there and people are experimenting in this field. Testers need to act much more like a pathfinder or navigator rather than a follower. Their activities don't come at the end of projects, their activities come throughout the projects. So they're acting as a navigator more than a victim, as I mentioned. They're also operating at multiple levels. They're talking to developers, of course, in a technical level of detail, but they must also be outward facing to business and stakeholders. The goal of testing overall is to increase the understanding of the definition, the requirements, and the delivery, what we've actually got, what our systems are capable of. The goal of testing is to increase definition and delivery understanding. Now, this is a different but broader goal than the traditional testers are there to find bugs. That's a very limited and a rather poor investment of time and effort. There's much more value in what testers do if we broaden the scope of what they do, bring them into the fold as a leader within the team, not just a follower. The Tester Skills Program challenges you to think for yourself. This is the whole point. The idea is that it's to teach you to excel in your craft and to teach others to excel too. Part of the scheme will be to bring in coaching and mentoring skills as part of the tester's toolkit, because testers will coach and mentor users, product owners, developers, ops people, whoever needs to test. It seems to me that it's the tester who's going to have to bring that mindset, that thinking into the project. So we need to bring coaching and mentoring into the skill set for testers too. Now with that, I'm done, but if you want to follow progress about what's happening in this program, you can join a mailing list just by sending a message to updates@testerskills.com. Just put subscribe in the subject line, or just mail me, or if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm sure I'll be keeping people up to date in that way as well. Overall, I think I'm done now. I think questions, very happy to take them. But overall, I'd say thank you for listening and for being interested and concerned in what I think is a very interesting project. Thank you.